All right, if you don't have a bulletin, I encourage you to grab one because on the back there'll be a place to take some notes. I'll kind of prompt you to fill that in. So if you don't have one, just throw your hand up. I'm sure Todd will love to throw one at you. But as we kind of get started this morning, I just kind of want to prompt your thinking to a time where you had an experience, a time where you messed up or made a mistake, and it forever changed your life habits. Now, I'm sure maybe for some of you, you're thinking of big, major things, but I had one of those experiences. But mine was a little less dramatic. In fact, back when I was in high school, I learned the importance of not over-torquing bolts. You guys understand what that is, right? Where you're putting a bolt into something and you put a little too much force on it and you strip those threads out. Because back in high school, I was riding motorcycles and I was changing the oil on my bike. And after I finished changing the oil, I began to put that drain bolt back in the case, and I felt like it needed to be a little tighter, and eventually it just kept spinning. And I had effectively stripped the bolts out of, or stripped the threads out of the side of my engine case. I over-torqued the bolt. I stripped it. And fortunately, my dad was there, and he taught me how to tap and rethread that hole. And since that experience, right, talk about PTSD, overly scarred. Since that experience, I am overly sensitive to how tight I torque bolts down. Now, some of the best lessons in life come from experiences, and that is a relatively harmless experience. But when I mention that, right, some of the best lessons in life come from experience, maybe what is conjured up in your mind are some very painful experiences that you've gone through. Some very painful lessons that you have had to learn. Maybe there was a season of your life where you found yourself in mountains and mountains of debt, right? Considering bankruptcy, considering some drastic options. And because of that experience, you never want to have to do anything with debt again, right? You never spend more money than you make now because of that experience. Maybe due to indiscretion, you made some poor choices while intoxicated. And now, because of the experiences that you went through, you now choose to not drink at all, or you drink much differently. Or maybe something, maybe a little less dramatic, but still a big deal. Maybe you used to be someone who put off assignments in school, or wouldn't do them all together. And you failed a class. You had to pay to retake it. And now, because of that experience, you no longer put assignments off, right? As soon as you get it, you got a plan to knock it out. You see, some of the best lessons in life come from experience. Now, as we are talking about seasons of transition that we are in, right? Every single one of us is in a season of transition in some capacity. Seasons of transitions often serve as seasons of growth. And so if you today find yourself in a season of transition as you're moving from one place to another, I want you to stop and reflect for a moment, because sometimes while we're in these seasons, we're so busy, so focused trying to get out, trying to recover, trying to get away from the environment we find ourselves in, that we don't stop and ask what needs to occur during this time. We never stop and ask, how might God be using this season in my life? We never stop to ask, what am I supposed to gain through this season? And some of us never even consider that we might be in this season because we have yet to learn what we need to learn. And so as we talk about seasons of life, seasons of transition, normally are places of life that we're in that we don't want to be, we want to get out of. What I want us just to kind of wrestle with this morning is this simple question: what needs to occur in our transitional phase, moving from one thing to the next? And so if you have your Bibles, grab them, turn to the book of Exodus. And we're going to be looking at a man's story, right? Moses in the book of Exodus. And don't panic, we're not going to be looking at 18 chapters of Exodus today. But I put this up here because it would be impossible for us to talk about Moses' life in depth in the short amount of time that we have. So I encourage you to go back and kind of read through his story. But instead, what we're going to do is kind of hit some highlights of his life. Because Moses, like every single one of us, has walked through seasons of transition, challenging seasons of our life. He walked through some very challenging seasons as well. But we're walking through this series that I entitled Transitions, right? What to do while we wait. And this has just kind of been on my heart for a season as I have been experiencing elements of this myself, as I have seen members of our church experience a transition in their life, going from one thing to the next. Some of these transitions were welcomed and helpful, others were painful and challenging. But every one of us, in some capacity, is in a state of transition, right? Moving from one place to the next. And I just want us to pause for a little bit and realize that God will use these transition periods in our life to accomplish some really important things. And so the whole purpose of this series and our conversation even for today is to help us answer the question, how do we best navigate the changes that are brought about a transition? And how do we emerge better on the other side? Right? What is God doing during this season of your life? So as I mentioned, we're talking about Moses today, and most of us, if you've grown up in church, have a picture of who Moses is in his life. And realistically, it's pretty accurate, right? Moses is the guy, right? We know him, the baby floating in the basket. He's found adrift on the Nile. He's raised in Pharaoh's home. He's the guy who led the Hebrew people out of Egypt. He led them through the wilderness for 40 years. And he's the guy who got the 10 Commandments from God. And then he had the responsibility of writing the Pentateuch, right? The first 5 books of the Old Testament, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. He is known and highly looked upon today as one of the key prophets and leaders of the Old Testament. And we know Moses for being a key prophet, a leader of Israel. But this is what we know him as today. But the question I want us to kind of wrestle with is what occurred in his life to elevate him to that role, to prepare him for the responsibility of leading an entire nation. Because you see, in his life and development was just as much about what didn't happen as what did happen. You see, Moses at numerous times in his life found himself in transition, and his life was put on hold. And while he was in these important transition phases, God used these seasons to prepare him for what was coming next. And so we're hitting the highlights of his life, but I want to remind you, you can go back and read his story in the book of Exodus. But one thing I want you to think about as we dive into his story is fundamental and important relationships that children have. You see, many experts, in fact, you don't even have to be an expert to acknowledge the important role parents have in the life of a child, particularly their mother, right? It's not ideal for a kid to be raised away from their parents. And sometimes they're raised away from them in a physical capacity, sometimes it's mentally. My point is, if you want to best prepare a child for the future, you don't separate them from their parents. Yet when you look at Moses' story, that's exactly the path that God had for him. So the first roadblock that Moses experienced, kind of the first transition in life he experienced, was he was separated from his family. Go ahead and take a look at Exodus chapter 1, verses 8 to 10. His story is introduced. It comes after Joseph's story, who we talked about just recently. It tells us this: Now there arose a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. So Moses' story starts with a transition of leadership in Egypt. Now remember, the Israelites ended up in Egypt because they were there because Joseph was there, and Joseph was providing care for them through Egypt. But now some time has passed, and there's a new dynasty in place in Egypt. And now, rather than viewing the Hebrew people as a helpful presence, they're now viewed as a liability. Egypt grows fearful of Israel. And so what they attempt to do, plan A, is to suppress Israel. They put them in slavery. Take a look at verses 11 and 12 of chapter 1. They developed this plan. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread about. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. Egypt attempts to suppress the Israelites by putting them into slavery, and they continue to grow in number. Now I want you to just note the term dread there in verse 12. It can mean loathe. It can mean abhor. The idea being is the entire population of Egypt, particularly the leadership, is beginning to hate the Jewish population, looking at them as less than, right? A species to be exterminated, right? Isn't that mess? Wow, this is a part of Israel's history. And so they try to oppress them. They try to limit their growth. This doesn't work, so they form a new plan, and this involves midwives. Look at chapter 1, verse 15 through 17. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, and the other Puah, when they serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. And the text tells us in verse 17, but the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So it doesn't work to suppress the Israelites through slavery and harsh labor. So the plan B is to get the midwives to kill the young boys as they are born, right? To kind of diminish their numbers. And the midwives are more fearful of God than they are of the Pharaoh, and so they don't comply. And so now we're going to go to plan C. And this is kind of where Moses' story intersects with history. Look at chapter 1, verse 22. Plan C, right? Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. Pharaoh orders the death of all Hebrew baby boys. I mean, talk about a sad season in Israel's history. Right, a lot of weeping. I could not imagine, but Pharaoh has the power that he has, and he employs the entire nation to begin to exterminate Hebrew boys. And this is where Moses' story intersects with Israel's history. Because Moses is one of these boys that was born during this time. And if you read through his story, his mother makes best attempts she can to hide him, right? Like any good mother would do. But it gets to the point where she can no longer hide him. And then rather than just turn him over to be killed, she decides to take her chances by letting him drift. She sets him afloat on the Nile River in hopes that somehow God might intervene for her little baby boy. And God does. God intervenes. And what we see in Moses' story is Pharaoh's daughter finds him adrift. And she takes compassion on him, right? For real, who can hold a little baby and not take compassion? And I think what's amazing in God's sovereignty with Moses' story is here you have someone circumventing Pharaoh's edict. Really, in reality, who can circumvent Pharaoh's edict? Right? Only a daughter can circumvent her father's command. And the neat part is Moses' mother still had a role in his development, at least through his early years. Right, read the story in Exodus. Pharaoh's daughter essentially recruits his mother to take care of Moses for a certain period of time. But Moses is eventually removed from his family and adopted into Pharaoh's family. Look at Exodus chapter 2, verse 10. Eventually he gets old enough and he's now kind of there, part of the family. It tells us this. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, because, she said, I drew him out of the water. So Moses, this is kind of one of these transition seasons in his life, whether he acknowledged it or not, right? His upbringing, he is separated from his family. Not an ideal situation. But how does God use this setback, this unexpected circumstance in his life? What you see from Moses is that he, in Pharaoh's home, gains formal training and experience for the future leadership role that he was going to fill for the Hebrew people. In fact, the growth that he experienced was he grew in a set of skills. In the book of Acts, Stephen recounts part of Israel's history, and this is what he says about Moses' life during this phase. Chapter 7, verse 22, Stephen says this, And Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was mighty in his words and deeds. So God sovereignly put Moses in Pharaoh's household to learn some very important skills. He learns to read and to write. Realistically, he was learning Egyptian. He learned Hebrew clearly as well. And while he's in Pharaoh's house, he has access to some of the best resources in the world. And while he's in this season, God prepares him, at least from an academic perspective, to write the Pentateuch. Right? He gained some very valuable skills for later in life. He also is exposed to not only academic skills, but leadership skills, right? He learns about military organization, how to organize and move people, a very valuable skill set he's going to need later in life. He learns architecture, the building of structures. God uses that season in his life to grow him, to give him a skill set for later use. And maybe for you, as you walk through a challenging season of your life, I want to make you pause for a second and just look inward and consider maybe God has you in this season to help you develop a skill set for the future. Maybe right now you're just really struggling. You're wrestling with God over a certain topic, and man, you've been running to Scripture trying to figure out, what does God say about this thing in my life? And maybe whether you realize it or not, God is teaching you how to intentionally study Scripture, helping you to develop a very important discipline that you might need to utilize later in life. Maybe God's using a season to make you slow down in your life. Maybe to go back to school, to pivot your career. Right? Maybe God has you in the season of your life to help you develop an important skill set that you will use later on. So, first roadblock he experiences is he's separated from his family. And as we look at Moses' life, one thing he encountered was loneliness. Have you ever had a moment like that in your life where you felt all alone? Right? Whether it was literally or metaphorically. When I think back in my life, I think of a time when I went away to school for the first time. Looking back, it doesn't feel like a big deal, but I remember at the time it was. Right? I grew up in one community. I knew a group of people. And when I went away to school, right, I moved to an area I was not familiar with. I didn't know a soul. And I felt very alone for a season. Clearly, I made some friends, found my wife. But maybe today you walk into church and you're walking through a season of life and you feel very alone. Right? Maybe literally you are alone, right? Your friends, your family have left you, abandoned you. Maybe you've hurt them and they've run from you. Maybe metaphorically you feel alone. You're walking through a situation and you have people around you, but they don't understand what you're going through. And the reality is, when we look at Moses' story, he can certainly identify with that feeling. See, when Moses rose and grew up in Egypt, he knew fundamentally that he was a Hebrew. And so he identifies with the Hebrew people. And so as you read his story in Exodus, he witnesses a scene one day of a person, a leader in Egypt that was abusing, that was hitting, harming one of his people. And so he intersects and he attempts to get this man off him. And based on the language, he accidentally kills this Egyptian. And he hides this body out in the desert. And it becomes known that this happens. And so Moses goes on the run. Moses goes on the run. I want to take a quick peek here. Take a look at Exodus chapter 2, verse 13 through 15. The day after he killed this Egyptian, this is what happens. When he went out the next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, "Why do you strike your companion?" He answered, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "Surely this thing is known." When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. Kind of pause there for a second. See, Moses killed an Egyptian, and the Hebrew people are very aware of it, and they kind of alienate him. And so what Moses does is he goes on the run. He is cut off at this point in his life from all Egyptian connections and all Hebrew connections, and he literally goes out to a barren land, right? The land of Midian, which actually isn't just a land, but it's more used to describe a group of people and a type of land they traversed across. But this next roadblock that Moses experiences in his transitional phase of life is he's exiled from Egypt. This next phase of Moses' life, he is effectively living in the wilderness for 40 years. He was 40 when he went into the wilderness, and he's 80 when he eventually leaves. He spent half his life wandering in a wilderness. And when his story finally picks back up in Scripture, a lot of time has passed, and he's found preoccupied taking care of his father-in-law's flock. Right? He made some friends as well. He got married, but he is still removed from really kind of his homeland, Egypt, and his home people, the Hebrew people. God has him there doing some hard work. He's gaining new experiences. He's learning to lead a stubborn group of animals. He has to do hard work. This is not something he had to do while he was living in the palace in Egypt. God is giving him some new experiences inadvertently, and God is also giving Moses some time to mature. It's likely, too, that during this season he was receiving mentorship from his father-in-law, Jethro. As this time in the wilderness comes to a close, I want you to kind of look at the language that the author chooses to describe Moses and the Hebrew people at this time. Look at chapter 2, verse 23 to 25. During those many days, right, this is kind of like in hindsight pulling back from Moses' story as he's in the wilderness in Midian. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, right? This is the guy that Moses was running from. And the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery, and they cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God. And God heard their groaning. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel. And I love this last part. And God knew. Right? The time is now right. The people are ready, and Moses is ready. He's been wandering in this wilderness for a long time, and God has been using this as a season to mature him. God has exiled Moses to Midian, but how does God use this setback in Moses' life? He uses it to grow him as a person. He uses this time for him to grow in maturity and life experience. Moses is now a guy that has the skill set to lead, and now he has some maturity and life experience to lead. He's been through the wilderness, literally, and he's ready now to lead a group of people through the wilderness as well. It makes me think back to some time I actually spent at the Stir Museum and learning some history of our area here and some of the journeys that people took through the area. Some stayed here, some kept going. What I always found amazing was many of the settlers out west, even in this part of the country, a lot of them didn't have a background in agriculture. I just always assumed that. They knew how to farm. Many of them grew up in the cities. They literally had a book that they were reading on how to do this. A lot of them, as they were traveling in their wagons out west, had never done something this extreme. And so a lot of them would hire guides, people who've done it before. A whole group of families would hire a guide to guide them through the process. They want someone who had been there before, someone who could lead them. And this is what you see in Moses' life. As he's out there in Midian, God is preparing Moses. He now has a skill set, and now he has the experience, someone who's been there before, to lead a group of people through some challenging seasons. You see, Moses' training in Egypt was unbalanced. The focus of his training in Egypt was self-sufficiency rather than dependence on God. But God used those 40 years in the desert to break Moses down, to remove him from this environment in Egypt for a season, to develop him, to mature him, to prepare him for the task he had at hand. As I was doing some reading and studying on this, I came across some notes regarding this season of Moses' life. I had a professor make this statement, and it's kind of stuck with me. He said this: God has not yet developed a shortcut program in developing a mature partner with himself. You see, the best thing that Moses needed to be prepared for the task ahead of him, the best thing that he needed was 40 years removed from an environment. 40 years of developing, 40 years of maturing. And that takes a long, long time. It's hard. And I just want you to consider, this is Moses' story. But maybe your story is like this as well, right? Maybe you're walking through a tough season, right? You are in year 20 in the wilderness. and you are waiting for what's next. You are pleading with God, get me out of this. I'm tired of this. I'm done with this. But maybe I want you to consider, maybe you need to sit there a little bit longer because you're not mature enough for what is coming next. Maybe God's using this season in your life to mature you, to grow you, to give you some experience. Maybe for what comes next, the time isn't ready. The person who needs you, the group that you are called to lead. Maybe you're still in that season because the time's not right. Maybe you don't have that skill set yet. And I'll tell you, that season is one of the hardest seasons to be in. It's an incredibly tough season. But again, God will use those seasons to mature us, to grow us, to prepare us for what's next. Now Moses, again, as we follow his story, he was exiled from Egypt effectively. He was on the run, fearful of his life, spent 40 years in the desert, and God comes to him and calls him back to Egypt because now he is ready. The people are ready. Moses is ready to lead. But the next big roadblock Moses has in front of him is he has an insurmountable task. I made that blank a little longer because that's a longer word for you. But he has an insurmountable task in front of him. See, Moses has a crazy task. He is supposed to free Israel from captivity. And this is something he is wholly incapable of doing by himself. In fact, when God appears to Moses in the burning bush and he gives him these instructions as he tells Moses about the plight of his people, what do we know about Moses' response? Right? Moses pushes back. Moses tells God that he can't do it. But God says he can. Look at Exodus chapter 3 and verse 10. As they have this interaction, God tells him this. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. God is done developing the nation of Israel in Egypt and is ready to begin to bring them into the promised land. And Moses is the guy that's called to lead them. But again, imagine if you were given this task. You would respond like Moses did. Look at verse 11 of chapter 3. Moses says this to God. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? Again, seriously, imagine his thought process. He's like, Egypt was a whole lifetime ago for me. I don't want to go back. They're not going to listen to me. Besides, who am I? And he continues to push back against this task that's put in front of him. Look at chapter 4 and verse 1. Moses says, but behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice. For they will say, the Lord did not appear to you. Look at verse 10 of chapter 4. He continues to push back. But Moses said to the Lord, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither in the past, nor since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and of tongue. Right? Moses this whole time is telling God he's got the wrong guy. He's like, sure, I was familiar with Egyptian culture. I used to be in the in crowd, but man, that was a long time ago, God. You got the wrong guy. Moses has this insurmountable task put in front of him, and he understandably resists the call. I mean, to me, it's like the modern day equivalent of trying to unite our country politically, right? It's not. It feels impossible, right? It's like saying, hey, I'm going to bring peace to the Middle East. This has been a problem for centuries. Why do I think I can solve it? Israel has been in Egyptian captivity for a long period this time. Why would he think that he could walk in and free them, especially considering his skill set and his background? But God says, Moses, I got this. I need you to partner with me. And what we see during this season as Moses goes to Israel and partners with God in this task, God grows him spiritually. In fact, that's the growth that occurs in his life during this season. God has given him a special skill set that he acquired while he was in Pharaoh's household early in his life. He has now grown him as a person as he's exiled in Egypt or in the wilderness for 40 years. And now through this next season as he leads Israel out of Egypt, God grows him spiritually. And there's so much more to Moses' life we don't have time to talk about. Obviously, we see evidence of the spiritual growth as he wrestles with Pharaoh, and Pharaoh eventually releases the Israelites, and they escape through the crossing of the Red Sea, and now they're wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. Right? There's so much more of Moses' life. But what you see is God is using these challenging seasons to grow Moses. So for us today, again, we're kind of cutting Moses' story short there, but I want to encourage you to go back and read it. What needs to occur in your transitional phase of life that you're in right now? What needs to occur? What do you need to do while you're here, while you're in a situation you don't want to be? Growth. There's room for growth in all of us. If you surrender to God during this season of your life, while you're in a place you don't want to be, if you surrender to God and say, you know what, this might not be where I want to be, God, but you have me here sovereignly. If you surrender to his process, to growing, man, you will reap some benefits on the other end. So what I want you to ask yourself, okay, I'm in this situation, I need to grow. Ask yourself today, where do I need to grow? Maybe God has me walking through this difficult season of life because I need to grow in maturity. Right? I'm not ready for what's next, and so he's walking me through this season. God's preparing me for something. Maybe he wants you to develop a skill set. Maybe a skill set of grieving. Maybe a skill set regarding academics or knowledge, because there's a person on the other end of this that you are called to lead. Where do you need to grow as you're in this transitional season? So going back to our opening conversation about me over-torquing the drain bolt on my motorcycle, as I said, I'm overly sensitive to this now, right? A little PTSD from stripping out a bolt on my motorcycle, right? I thought it was the end of the world. And it was, right? But now, right, when I'm putting bolts in, if you're ever around me working on stuff, I have multiple torque wrenches, and I'm always looking for torque specs. And I'm actually, my philosophy is now is I'd rather have a bolt fall off than overstrip it, right? And maybe not the best philosophy, that's where I'm at, right? That experience changed the way I handle something as simple as putting a bolt in to a piece of equipment. But I want to encourage you, as you are going through some difficult experiences today in transition, did not let this period of transition go to waste. Use it as an opportunity to grow because it will change you. Maybe you need to gain training and experience for future leadership needs, and that's why God has you in this season. Maybe you need to grow in a skill set. Maybe you need to grow in maturity and life experience. Yeah, God has called you to some amazing things. He wants you to do some fantastic leadership things in the future, but frankly, you're not ready yet, and so you're walking through a season until you're ready. Maybe he wants you to learn to partner with him and to trust him. And so he wants you to go through a season of growing spiritually because you're not ready to lead anyone spiritually because, frankly, your spiritual life stinks. Don't let this period of transition go to waste. So I just want to encourage you today as you walk through a challenging season of life to look up and ask the question, where do I need to grow? God, I'm not in the place I want to be, but clearly this is where you have me. What do you want to accomplish during this season in my life? And I have two questions that kind of prompt those thoughts in your mind I want to end with. Question number one, what challenging season of life are you walking through? And what might God want you to learn during this season of life? Let's close in a word of prayer. Lord, thank you for just this opportunity to look at Moses' life. Lord, as we look at his life, it's so easy to compress it to a relatively short story, but man, his seasons of transition and training were long and they were hard. Man, but as we look at the entirety of his life, we can see how you sovereignly guided him through those seasons to prepare him for what's next. And so, God, as people here in this building are walking through challenging seasons as well, periods of frustration, periods of grief, even periods of excitement, Lord, I pray that we pause for a moment and just ask the question, what are you doing here? Lord, how do you want us to grow? How are you using this experience to shape our future and our purpose? So God, I pray that you provide some perspective to these challenges, and maybe it even provides a bit of hope as we're walking through a dark place. God, thank you for Moses' story. Thank you for this text. And thank you for loving us and using these painful experiences to grow us for your glory. Be with us this week. In your name, amen.